Coffee can raise your risk of a heart attack. Coffee can also lower your risk of a stroke. Both of those sentences are true, according to the largest analysis of its kind ever done. A team of researchers in Qatar and Egypt just pulled together data from 38 studies and almost 2.9 million people to answer a question that sounds simple and really isn't. Is coffee good or bad for your heart? The answer, published in the journal BMC Cardiovascular Disorders, turns out to depend entirely on which part of your cardiovascular system you're asking about. We're going to walk through exactly what they found, condition by condition, how solid the evidence actually is for each one, and what the researchers themselves say you should take away from it. Over 1 billion people drink coffee worldwide. Up to 73% of coffee drinkers have it every single day, while less than 4% drink it as rarely as once a week. Coffee isn't just caffeine. It's a mix of lipids, carbohydrates, minerals, vitamins, and phenolic compounds, and caffeine content alone swings wildly, anywhere from 4 to 180 milligrams per cup, depending on how it's brewed. At low doses, caffeine stimulates the central nervous system. It increases urination, relaxes smooth muscle, stimulates the heart muscle, and ramps up stomach acid production. It's also been linked to lower rates of type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, cancer, and Parkinson's disease, though nobody fully understands the mechanism, especially since decaffeinated coffee shows similar effects in some studies. At high doses, though, caffeine can trigger anxiety, nausea, and jitteriness. So dose clearly matters in both directions. Earlier reviews had already hinted at this split personality. One recent umbrella review of 11 meta-analyses found heavy coffee consumption raised cardiovascular disease risk overall, but also reduced the risk of dementia and both major types of stroke. Another major review found coffee seemed to protect against stroke, had an unclear relationship with coronary heart disease, and seemed to lower heart failure risk at moderate intake, 1 to 5 cups a day, while its effect on atrial fibrillation stayed genuinely unresolved. But those earlier reviews had real gaps. Most of them treated coffee and caffeine as if they were interchangeable, even though coffee contains plenty of other active compounds beyond caffeine. Most also lumped cardiovascular outcomes together into one composite category, which hides what's actually happening with specific conditions like arrhythmias. And none of them included the newest cohort studies from the past few years. So this team set out to fix all three problems at once: treat coffee and caffeine as separate exposures, break outcomes down by specific condition, and fold in the latest research. The review followed PRISMA 2020, the standard reporting framework for this kind of study, and the protocol was registered in advance on Prospero, the International Registry for Systematic Reviews, before a single result was in. That pre-registration matters. It's a public commitment to the methodology before anyone knows what the data will show, which closes the door on quietly changing the rules once the results come in. The researchers searched 5 major databases: PubMed, Web of Science, Cochrane Library, Embus, and Scopus, covering everything published between 2000 and December 2025, plus gray literature, clinical trial registries, preprint servers, the Cs, and dissertations to minimize publication bias. The initial search returned 2,266 records. After removing over 1,500 exact duplicates, 754 studies went through title and abstract screening. 699 of those were excluded as irrelevant, leaving 55 for full-text review. 17 more were cut at that stage, mostly animal studies and review articles, leaving a final set of 38 studies that made it into the analysis. 2 reviewers screened everything independently, and their agreement was strong, especially at the full-text stage, where it reached what statisticians call near-perfect agreement. Of the 38 included studies, 33 were cohort studies, mostly prospective, following people forward in time, and 5 were case control studies. Altogether, they covered 2,856,002 participants. Study quality was checked with 2 established tools: the Newcastle-Ottawa Scale for cohort studies and the Joanna Briggs Institute checklist for case control studies. 20 cohort studies scored as good quality, 13 as fair, and every single case control study scored as good quality. Now the actual results, starting with coronary heart disease, the broadest category. 7 studies looked at this, and when pooled together, there was no significant link between coffee consumption and coronary heart disease at all, regardless of gender. Myocardial infarction, a heart attack specifically, is where the picture turns less favorable. 6 studies measured this, and high coffee consumption came with a 48% higher risk of heart attack compared to low consumption. That result is worth taking seriously for a specific reason. Unlike most of the other findings in this study, it showed essentially no variation between the different studies, meaning every study pointed in the same direction. That consistency gives it real statistical weight. Interestingly though, when the researchers split that same heart attack data by gender, the association became statistically non-significant in both men and women separately, even though it stayed strong for the combined population. Smaller subgroups simply have less statistical power to detect the same effect. Stroke tells the opposite story. High coffee consumption was linked to a significantly lower risk of stroke overall, and when broken down by type, the protection was concentrated almost entirely in ischemic stroke, the most common kind, caused by a blocked blood vessel. There was no significant link, in either direction, with hemorrhagic strokes, the kind caused by bleeding in the brain. So this is a targeted effect, not a blanket one. Heart failure showed no significant association either way, in 5 pooled studies, and that held true when the data was split by gender too. Arrhythmias, irregular heartbeats, showed a modest protective association when 3 studies were combined. High coffee consumption came with a lower risk of having any arrhythmia at all. But when the researchers broke that down into specific arrhythmia types, atrial fibrillation, supraventricular tachycardia, and ventricular tachycardia, none of those individual associations reached statistical significance on their own. The overall protective signal is real, but fragile once you zoom in. Then there's caffeine specifically, separate from coffee as a whole, and its relationship to cardiovascular death. Here the researchers split people into 3 groups: the general population, people with diabetes or prediabetes, and people with hypertension. In the general population, no significant link between caffeine intake and cardiovascular death. Same story in people with diabetes or prediabetes, no significant link. But in people with hypertension specifically, high caffeine intake was associated with 32% lower cardiovascular mortality compared to low caffeine intake. That's arguably the single most surprising number in the entire study. It runs directly against older dietary advice that told hypertensive patients to cut caffeine to protect their hearts. This data suggests that blanket restriction for this specific group may not be supported by the evidence. One more caffeine-specific result: no significant association between caffeine intake and atrial fibrillation risk, and this particular finding was consistent across every study that measured it. So why the split personality? The authors offer a biological explanation for each result, and it's worth walking through because the mechanisms are genuinely different for each condition. For the heart attack risk, the leading explanation is that high coffee intake activates the sympathetic nervous system, raising heart rate, how forcefully the heart contracts, and the heart's oxygen demand, which can trigger problems in people who already have underlying risk. High coffee intake has also been linked to elevated homocysteine, a compound tied to cardiovascular risk. For stroke, the explanation runs through inflammation and blood vessel health, rather than the heart itself. Coffee is rich in antioxidant phenolic compounds that appear to support blood vessel lining function and slow the buildup of arterial plaque, and regular coffee drinking has been linked to lower levels of inflammatory markers like C-reactive protein. For arrhythmias, the leading theory is that regular coffee drinkers build tolerance over time, which blunts caffeine's initial tendency to provoke irregular heart rhythms. Coffee has also been linked to better insulin sensitivity and lower type 2 diabetes risk, both of which independently reduce arrhythmia risk, plus anti-inflammatory compounds like chlorogenic acid that may help stabilize the heart's electrical activity. For the caffeine and hypertension finding, researchers point to caffeine's antioxidant and anti-atherogenic properties, including its ability to suppress the oxidation of LDL cholesterol, plus a caffeine metabolite called 7-methyluric acid that may actually help lower blood pressure. Now for the honest caveats, because there are several, and the authors themselves are upfront about every one of them. This is a meta-analysis of mostly cohort and case control studies, not randomized controlled trials. That means these are strong statistical associations, not proof that coffee directly causes any of these outcomes. Coffee and caffeine intake were self-reported in every included study, measured at a single point in time, with no tracking of how people's habits changed over the years. Only English language studies were eligible, which introduces a real risk of selection bias, even though the researchers tried to offset that with an extensive gray literature search. And categories of high consumption varied enormously between studies. In some, high meant 2 or more cups a day. In others, it meant 8 or more. Comparing across such different thresholds limits how precisely any single result can be interpreted. There was also meaningful statistical heterogeneity in some of the pooled results, especially for coronary heart disease overall, and for arrhythmias, meaning individual studies didn't always agree closely with each other, even when the combined result pointed one direction. The researchers handled that heterogeneity the standard statistical way. When studies disagreed with each other significantly, they used a random effects model, which is more conservative and accounts for that disagreement. When studies lined up closely, they used a simpler fixed effects model instead. One gap the authors specifically flag for future research is how coffee gets prepared. Unfiltered or boiled coffee contains far higher levels of compounds called diterpenes, which have been linked to changes in blood cholesterol. But there wasn't enough data across the included studies to actually test whether brewing method changes any of these cardiovascular associations. They're also calling for more dose-response research, meaning studies designed specifically to find the exact threshold where risk starts climbing or protection starts kicking in, rather than just comparing a vague highest category against a vague lowest one. It's worth being clear about what kind of evidence this actually is. Every single number in this study comes from observational research, cohort and case control studies that track what people already do, not controlled experiments that randomly assign people to drink more or less coffee. That distinction matters enormously. Observational data can reveal strong, consistent patterns, like the heart attack association here, without proving that coffee itself is the direct cause. People who drink a lot of coffee may differ from people who don't in dozens of other ways that are hard to fully account for statistically. So what's the actual takeaway? The researchers are explicit about this. Coffee and caffeine's cardiovascular effects are complex and outcome-specific, not consistently good or consistently bad. Their practical conclusion is that broadly restricting coffee in the general healthy population probably isn't justified by this evidence. But moderation does make sense for people who already have diagnosed ischemic heart disease, or who know they are especially sensitive to coffee's effects. For people with hypertension specifically, The data suggests old blanket caffeine restrictions may deserve a second look, with more individualized guidance replacing one-size-fits-all rules. The bottom line, in the researchers' own words, coffee's relationship with your heart isn't a single yes or no answer. It depends on which condition you're asking about, and increasingly, it may depend on who you are too.